The Battle of the Pelennor Fields should have failed for a multitude of reasons. So why is it that it's one of the most memorable and emotional moments in the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy? Between coordinating a massive fight sequence on film and then having to fill in plot holes that they created for themselves earlier in the trilogy, Peter Jackson and his team somehow produced one of the greatest scenes in fantasy cinema. And today, I'm not only going to reveal why these scenes worked, but we'll look at why they should have failed, as Peter Jackson and the other writers completely changed almost every aspect of Tolkien's original epic battle. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 41 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, Lord of the Rings edition. This is the show where each week I take scenes from the Lord of the Rings film adaptations and compare them to Tolkien's original books, finding all the differences along the way. Today, we've made it to the second half of the Return of the King film, and one of my favorite moments, the Ride of the Rohirrim and the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. Before we go any further though, I wanted to give a shout out to this commenter from a previous episode. Each week, I highlight one of the top comments from a past video, so be sure to share your thoughts down below when you're done watching. Per usual, I'll cover all the changes across the four major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's recap what happened during these scenes in the movie. And just a heads up, there's a lot to cover today. Picking up with where we last left our Rohirrim, we see Merry and Eowyn talking as the army of Rohan has stopped to camp for a bit. But soon after this talk, they pick back up camp and the Rohirrim continue on their journey to Minas Tirith. We then see a few scenes which I've already covered in previous episodes of Movies vs. Manuscripts, so go back and check those out if you need to catch up. But for today, we'll fast forward to when the Rohirrim show up on the fields of the Pelennor, and we listen to Theoden give one of the greatest speeches ever before charging into the enemy. After the charge, the movie cuts to Denethor, who is soaking himself with oil in preparation to be burnt along with Faramir, but before his servants can light the fire, Gandalf and Pippin charge in. However, as they charge in, Denethor grabs a torch from one of his servants and lights the wood around them. Gandalf rides forth and Pippin shoves Faramir off the pyre, and then Denethor gets kicked into the fire and runs out to his death. This then transitions back to the battle as the fight rages on and the Mumakil show up on the field. Theoden and his riders charge toward this new onslaught, and many of them get wiped out. In this montage of fighting, we see Éomer take out a Mumakil rider, and Eowyn do the same. Then the movie cuts back to the city as Gandalf and Pippin wait for orcs to burst through the next door in the city's defense, and Gandalf gives a nice mini speech to cheer up Pippin. Then we cut back down to the battlefield as Theoden is confronted by the Witch King, whose fell beast picks up Snowmane, Theoden's horse, and throws him down. Theoden gets crushed under Snowmane and lies there helpless until Eowyn approaches. She then cuts off the head of the beast and then faces the Witch King, who breaks her arm. Before we finish their fight, the movie cuts to the Anduin as the orcs are waiting for their pirate allies to show up. But sadly for the orcs, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli jump out of the ships with the army of the dead right behind them. We then switch back to Eowyn fighting the Witch King, who is about to choke her, but right before she can, Merry comes from behind and stabs him in the leg, giving Eowyn the opportunity to reveal herself and shove her sword right into the Witch King's face. This causes the Witch King to implode, and he is officially defeated, but at a great cost as Eowyn is severely injured and Theoden lay dying. The battle then finishes out as Legolas takes down a Mumakil by himself, Aragorn unintentionally saves Eowyn's life as Gothmog tries to chase her, and the army of the dead kill all the orcs in the White City. We then watch Theoden share his final moments with Eowyn, and then Aragorn releases the dead army as he holds their oath fulfilled. And finally, as everyone looks over the wreckage of the battle, Éomer finds his sister passed out, and Pippin finds Merry's cloak, but no Merry. And that is where we'll end things for this week. So now that you're all caught up, let's jump right into our first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. First up for characters, we're missing quite a few people who were involved in the battle in the book. These include, but are not limited to, Prince Imrahil, Elfhelm, Forlong, Halbarad and the Grey Company, and Elrohir and Elladan. I say not limited to because at the end of the chapter titled The Battle of the Pelennor Fields, Tolkien has a song that the surviving men wrote to honor the dead. In this song, there are many captains and men named who served and died in the battle, but I won't go through all those right now. In addition to those who were in the battle, we're missing Gon-Burigan, the chieftain of the Druidine people, and Baragond. Also, to wrap up our character changes, I need to mention again that Gothmog was not as involved as the movie shows. He gets one brief mention in the book, and I personally think he might have been a Nazgul, not an ugly-looking orc. Although I guess all orcs are ugly. Anyway, for timeline, we have two changes. First, the Rohirrim's journey from Dunharrow to the Pelennor Fields was 5 days long. We of course just see the start, a brief scene in the middle, and then their arrival at the fight. But the book contains a whole chapter's worth of information about this 5-day journey, which I'll cover in the plot changes. The second timeline change is that the phases of the battle itself are messed up. For example, the Mumakil don't show up until after Theoden dies in the book, but that has more to do with the plot changes, so I'll save the details of that event for later. Finally, our only location change for this week is the fact that once again, Peter Jackson and his team decided to completely remove Rhomis Ecor, which was the wall that defended Minas Tirith and its surrounding fields. This was a massive part of their defense and influenced the battle itself, but I guess it would have been too annoying to add in every scene of post-production, so they just decided to remove it entirely and make the land completely open. Now, before we get into the plot changes, I just want to remind you that I can't go word for word through Tolkien's dialogue in the book, because that would take longer than the movies themselves. And specifically today, we have several conversations that are pretty extensive that I can't cover. So if you're interested in checking them out, I highly encourage you to get the audiobooks on Audible. The audiobooks help you relive these moments in a whole new way. And you can use my link in the description to claim your free trial, which gets you one free audiobook of your choice, and it supports the channel at the same time. Anyway, with that being said, let's dive into the plot changes. Just to prep you for the changes this week, things will be split up into 4 different sections, some smaller and some larger. First, the Rohirrim's journey from Dunharrow to Minas Tirith. Second, the start of the battle. Third, the Pyre of Denethor. And fourth, the final moments of the battle. So starting with section 1, which is the journey of the Rohirrim, our first change is that in the book, Merry doesn't know who Dernhelm is. He simply gets picked up by a young rider and then doesn't find out that it's Eowyn until she reveals herself to the Witch King later in battle. So this first scene in which Merry and Eowyn talk for a bit never would have happened in the book. And along with this same change, Eowyn wouldn't have just removed her helmet and then stood in the open during broad daylight. Now, beyond this brief moment in the movie, we don't get any other context for Rohan's journey from Dunharrow to the Pelennor, which is our next change, as in the book, we actually get a good bit of information about this time period. In fact, it takes up a whole chapter before the battle itself. Now don't worry, we will get to the battle in a moment, but I briefly want to touch on the crucial details from this chapter in the book, because they directly impact the Rohirrim's arrival on the battlefield. Plus, you know the rules, I have to mention everything anyway. So let's go one by one through these key points we miss, and then we'll get into section 2 of our changes for this week. First, after a 4-day ride, Merry was exhausted and lonely as we learn that Dernhelm didn't speak to anyone. He also noticed that Elfhelm, the captain of their Eored, had some sort of agreement with Dernhelm, and all the men of their company ignored Merry completely. The second detail is that once they got to be a day's ride from the outer walls of the Pelennor, scouts had been sent ahead, but some never came back, and those who did said that the enemy was holding the road against them. This put the Rohirrim in a tight spot, as haste was needed, but they didn't know how to navigate through or around this obstacle. And that's where a key missing character, Gon Burigon, comes into play. You see, while Merry was in camp, he got bored and ended up eavesdropping on Theoden's conversation with Gon Burigon, the chieftain of the Druidine people who lived in that area. These people did not care for the men of Rohan, but they hated orcs more, and therefore Gon told Theoden that they would help Rohan by guiding the Rohirrim through paths that the orcs do not know. Which brings us to the third and final part of this important journey, as the next day they traveled along this alternate path, which was difficult because it was only wide enough for a few people at a time, and they needed to get thousands of men on horseback through. But after making it to their destination, they learned 2 things. First, that Rhomis Ecor, the wall, had been destroyed by the orcs, and therefore left an opening for the Rohirrim to get through. And second, some scouts found dead bodies of Gondorian messengers, one of whom was most likely Hirgon. Theoden realized that Minas Tirith had not heard of their coming since the Red Arrow never made it back to the city, and this helped increase their urgency in making it to the battlefield. Eventually, the men of Rohan came upon the wall, they slew the few orcs who were working there, and then Theoden gave instructions to his captains who slowly led their individual Eoreds through the wall and into the Pelennor. And this is what sets up for the ride of the Rohirrim scene in the movie. Now, all of this contributes to what should have made the film version not work. As you can tell, the movie removed all of these details. There's no Druidine in the movie, no wall, and no long journey to the fields of Gondor. And it's not like Tolkien was just adding these moments for funsies. No, they specifically set up the battle that we're about to dive into, as the Rohirrim's entrance through this broken part of the wall is what gave them the edge in battle, because the enemy never saw them coming. Tolkien even writes that the Witch King's will was bent upon the city and his focus wasn't on the wall, especially because no messengers had delivered news of the Rohirrim's arrival. So by the time that Rohan gathers on the field and charges the orcs, it's too late for the enemy. But even with this strategic plot hole in Jackson's adaptation, it almost doesn't even seem to matter, as we cut to the next scene in the movie, which is one of the most poignant moments in the entire trilogy. And that is the beginning of the battle itself, which means we're now into section 2 of our changes for this week. And this section is pretty easy as it only contains 2 smaller changes. The first one in this section is quite simple, and it's that Theoden's speech is only partly his. Technically, the most famous part of this epic speech, which is when he shouts death, is actually pulled from Eomer's later speeches in the book as he led the Rohirrim after Theoden died. Now again, this is a change that normally people would be upset at, but I think the way they wrote this speech to kick off the battle was perfect, and Bernard Hill's delivery of these lines is simply epic, so no complaints here. I was even tearing up a little bit watching it for this week, preparing this episode. But anyway, the second change is another one that I don't mind, which is that in the book, the Rohirrim actually start singing while they're fighting. This could have been epic or really thrown people off during the movie. So just to be on the safe side, it's probably best they didn't include it since it just didn't fit the theme of the overall trilogy. Plus, the movie almost immediately cuts away to Denethor pouring oil all over himself, so there wouldn't have been enough time to really showcase this singing/war chanting on the part of Rohan. And speaking of good old Denethor, we can now move on to section 3 of today's changes, as we look at Faramir's near-death experience. This section contains some crucial changes and omissions, and if you haven't read the books, then you're in for a treat as you'll learn about one of my favorite characters, Beregond. But before we get to him, we have one small change to start this section. Just for some context, the last place we saw Gandalf in the book was at the front gate of the city confronting the Witch King. So picking back up from that point of view, the Witch King left the front gate on horseback, and we get a little teaser that he had many other dark weapons at his command, which I think is foreshadowing for him switching his mount and riding a fell beast. So that's part of this first change, as the movie shows the Witch King already on a flying beast. And the second part of this change is that Pippin technically hadn't spoken to Gandalf until after the Witch King left. Once he did, Pippin ran up to Gandalf and told him all about Faramir, and the two rode off together. As they rode away from the fight, they ran into Prince Imrahil, who was heading out to support Rohan. Gandalf informed him that he had to go take care of other matters, but to take command in the Lord's absence. Then he and Pippin rode on. And that brings us to our next change, which is the removal of Beregond's entire involvement in this matter. In the movie, we have no Beregond, and we just see Gandalf and Pippin burst in the door atop Shadowfax and save the day. But in the book, here is what really happens. Eventually, Gandalf and Pippin came to the door of the Citadel and found the porter there dead with his key gone, and we'll discuss his fate momentarily. But in a rush, Gandalf and Pippin continued through the door and found a horrible sight. Beregond was on the topmost step leading to where Denethor had his pyre, and he was guarding the door with sword drawn as other guards with swords and torches were at the bottom of the steps. 2 guards had already fallen to his sword, and the others now looked on, cursing him and calling him a traitor. Now, if you remember, the last we heard about Beregond in a previous episode was that Pippin had told him Denethor had gone mad, and he now needed to decide if he would obey the Lord's command or if he would help defend Faramir. Obviously, Beregond chose to defend his captain, and because of this, he had committed treason. But on the other hand, he's the only reason Faramir was still alive. Now, as Gandalf and Pippin approached, we have our next change, which is that Gandalf's confrontation with Denethor is much different from the movie. Not only because Beregond is removed, but because in the movie, Denethor lights the pyre and Gandalf and Pippin have to save Faramir while it's ablaze. But in the book, Gandalf jumped up the steps right as Denethor, who was inside the House of the Stewards, came out of the door to kill Beregond himself. Thankfully, Gandalf was quicker and caused Denethor's sword to fall out of his hand. He then confronted the Lord of the City and asked where Faramir was. And upon finding out that he was inside, he ran in with Pippin and Beregond behind him and found Faramir resting on a pile of wood. Which brings us to another small change, as Gandalf jumped up on top of the pyre and lifted Faramir up, taking him off. Obviously in the movie, they give this to Pippin, as possibly they just wanted to give him something to do so he wouldn't just be standing there. The next small change is that the pyre is not on fire when all of this is happening, as Beregond had kept them from taking the torches inside of the building. Anyway, besides those 2 small changes, we now come to the next large omission, which carries us into the narrative of Denethor's madness. Up until this point, Gandalf was unaware of Denethor's use of the Palantir, and didn't know what caused him to go mad. But as they stood there over top Faramir, Denethor went on a long monologue, which I won't get into now, and he eventually revealed the Palantir to them, telling them that he knows all hope is lost because he has seen it in the stone. Gandalf continued to try to reason with him, but it was useless, and Denethor eventually called for his servants who were still loyal to him and told them to light the pyre. Even if he couldn't take Faramir with him, he himself would still perish in the flames. Which brings us to the next change, as Denethor doesn't light on fire and then run out of the building and jump off the top of the city. No, he actually takes it like a crazy man and stands in the flames, breaking his steward's staff and then grabbing the Palantir and holding it between his hands as he burnt on the pyre. And at that, Denethor is dead. Now, before we move into the final section of today's video and Theoden's demise, we have one more omitted moment from this section, which is the aftermath of Denethor's death. Obviously, there are men who have been slain around them, and Faramir is sick, so Gandalf instructs Denethor's loyal servants to take care of their dead, and then, along with Beregond and Pippin, he takes Faramir to the Houses of Healing. As they pass the steward's door, Beregond looks at the slain porter and shares his grief, as he says the porter wouldn't let him pass and he had to kill him, but he greatly regrets it. There's also a point where they hear a shrill cry louder than anything coming from the battlefield, and then their hearts are filled with hope. Obviously, this is when Eowyn had slain the Witch King, which we'll cover momentarily. But just to finish off the last part of this omitted moment, we get some dialogue between Pippin and Gandalf as Pippin explains how he finally understands what caused Denethor to go mad, meaning the Palantir, and then Gandalf instructs Beregond to go to the chief of the guard and explain what has happened. Gandalf says that Beregond will most likely be released from his post for his treason, but instructs him to tell the chief that Mithrandir advises Beregond to be sent to guard Faramir's body from that point forward. Then Gandalf takes Pippin and they set out to the lower parts of the city. Now, just to jump ahead a bit here so we can wrap up all the scenes with Gandalf and Pippin before getting back to the battlefield, there are two changes with the scene that we get of the two of these characters waiting for a fight in the city. The first change is that this never would have happened because they were busy with the whole Faramir incident I just described, and orcs never made it inside the city in the book's version of the battle. Remember, right as they busted down the gate and the Witch King entered, Rohan arrived and drew the orcs away. The second change here is more like a fun fact actually, and it's that the lines Gandalf has here about white shores and beyond and a far green country under a swift sunrise are actually pulled from Frodo's dream at Tom Bombadil's house. Obviously, since that whole section was removed, the writers for the movie could easily pick the best lines and spread them throughout the rest of the trilogy. But anyway, that's all the changes for this brief scene, the main one being it never happened. Now, back to the battle itself, we are finally to the fourth section of today's changes, as we still need to cover Theoden's death, the defeat of the Witch King, and the arrival of the dead army in the movie. To start, we have three changes all revolving around the Mumakil. First, as far as I am aware, the first mention of the Mumakil comes after Theoden dies, so the whole scene of the Rohirrim regrouping and charging the new onslaught of the Haradrim is wrong, but it does seem to be inspired from Eomer's later charge, which we'll cover in a bit. The second and third changes regarding the Mumakil are kind of the same. Eomer doesn't single-handedly bring one down, nor does Eowyn. The Eowyn specifically really irks me, because if it was that easy, why didn't they wipe out these beasts in a few minutes? The Mumakil are hit with dozens of arrows, slashed constantly, and speared as the Rohirrim ride by, and none of them fall. But suddenly, Eowyn goes in and with a sword in each hand, she cuts down a Mumakil all on her own. It just doesn't make much sense to me. But anyway, moving on, the whole fight scene with the Haradrim isn't totally made up, because we do read that as the orcs were fought back, the Haradrim came to help, just without their Mumakil. And that brings us to the next change, as we read about Theoden's fearless charge. A chieftain of the Haradrim approached, surrounded by his men and a banner of their people, and Theoden, waiting for no one else, spurred Snowmane toward him and brought him down with a spear. Then he slew the bearer of the banner, and all the rest of the men fled at this sight. This would have been way more epic than the Mumakil in my opinion, as it would have given Theoden a little bit more of a cool stand before his death, instead of just aimlessly riding into the giant elephants. Don't get me wrong, it's still cool in the movie version, but picture Theoden single-handedly taking down a chieftain of the Haradrim right before the Witch King flies in. Let me know in the comments if you would have preferred to see that. Anyway, speaking of the Witch King, that brings us to that scene, which might be one of the most integral parts of the entire battle. Initially, this moment is quite similar, with Theoden rallying his men, them cowering in fear as the Nazgul atop a fell beast approached, and then Snowmane getting thrown and crushing his rider. The first change comes when Eowyn arrives, and is actually that she reveals herself before cutting the head off the fell beast, which does actually happen in the book, by the way. This was one of the more unrealistic moments in the movie that I thought there's no way this actually happened. Then when I read the books as I was older, I was like, wow, that actually happened. But that being said, after Eowyn revealed herself in the book, the beast dove at her and she cut its head off, and then everything else happened very quickly. The Witch King arose, broke Eowyn's arm, went in for the kill but was stopped by Merry stabbing him in the leg, and then Eowyn used her last strength to shove her sword into the Witch King's face. All of this takes up only a few sentences in the chapter, and is over just as quickly as it began. And you might be thinking, Gibby, that sounds pretty similar to the movie. Well, it really is, but the next change I wanted to mention is more of an omitted detail that goes all the way back to the Fellowship of the Ring, and that is Merry's dagger. You see, in the movie, there's no reasoning given as to why Merry's blade was able to pierce the Witch King's ghostly skin and make him susceptible to Eowyn's attack. In fact, a lot of movie viewers are given the perception that it was only because Eowyn is a woman that she's able to kill the Witch King. But in the book, we know exactly why she's able to, and it's not because she's female. Remember the hobbits' near-death experience in the Barrow Downs? How Tom Bombadil saved them and then took some of the weapons out of the mounds and gave them to the hobbits? Well, these weapons were known as the Barrow Blades, or Daggers of Westernesse. I can't go into the entire lore of them right now, so maybe I'll make a video about them in the future. But essentially, these were weapons that were crafted by the Dunedain during their war against the Witch King of Angmar. You know, the same dude that Eowyn just killed? It's one of those moments that isn't so much luck as it is fate, but it explains why Merry was able to pierce the Nazgul, because his blade was made for that exact purpose. Anyway, like I said, maybe I'll do a longer video about it in the future, but right now we need to get back to the rest of these changes, which we're almost done with for today. Next up, the movie changed who speaks to Theoden in his final moments. In the book, Eowyn actually passes out, and then Merry is the one who crawls over to the king and talks to him. It's a very heartfelt moment in the book, but it brings up a good question. Were the filmmakers right to switch this to being Eowyn? After all, in the movie, the king's connection with Eowyn is way stronger than Merry's connection. But in the book, Tolkien had specifically written things from Merry's point of view and developed their relationship, as the king and the hobbit had spent days on end riding next to each other over the last couple weeks. So again, let me know in the comments what you would have preferred to see. Next, we have 3 smaller changes, which I'll just cover here rapid fire. 1. The movie removed Theoden's true final moments in which he proclaimed Éomer king. 2nd, Éomer saw Eowyn lying next to the king and presumed her dead, although we know that she was just passed out and injured. In the movie version, Éomer doesn't find his sister until the very end of the battle. And 3rd, to go back to the movie version, the whole moment of Gothmog chasing Eowyn only to be killed by Aragorn is made up. After all, as we've discussed, Gothmog is only mentioned one time in the book. And now that those brief changes are out of the way, we have a handful of omitted moments from the book, starting with Prince Imrahil riding out from the city to give aid to the Rohirrim. As he rode out, he encountered the few men who were taking Eowyn and Theoden back to the city, and the most important part of this interaction is that he is the one who recognizes Eowyn is still alive. At this point, everybody there thinks she's dead. But after Imrahil realizes this, he urged them to carry her to the Houses of Healing, and then he continued on with his small army to join the fight. The next omitted moment is Éomer's charge after leaving Theoden's body. In this charge is when the Mumakil finally show up. Honestly, it seems to be pretty similar to the charge we see in the movie, except for the fact that Theoden is dead, and so it is Éomer who is leading the Rohirrim. This is the charge in which Éomer gives his speech and ends it with saying death. And he says death because he has just seen Theoden, his father figure, and Eowyn, his sister, lying dead on the ground, or so he thinks. Like I said earlier, this speech, and specifically the death part, were picked out and handed to Theoden for the initial charge in the movie, which I have no problems with. The battle then raged on, and like I said, Prince Imrahil soon joined the fight, but the end seemed to be near for the men of Rohan and Gondor, as they could see hundreds of orcs pouring out from Osgiliath, as well as the corsairs from Umbar sailing up the Anduin. But Imrahil and Éomer were content with dying in the battle as their last stand, and they fought on. And that brings us to our final changes, as you might have noticed that I haven't addressed Aragorn yet. Well, like I said in the timeline changes, the phases of the battle are moved around in the movie. In the book, Aragorn doesn't arrive until these final moments. As Éomer rallied his men and prepared for a final charge to their death, he watched as Aragorn's kingly standard was hoisted up in the ship he was sailing, and Éomer knew what it meant. He then shouted for joy at the sight of the white tree on that banner, and hope was rekindled in the hearts of the men on the battlefield. Tolkien continues on by saying that after a while of fighting, Aragorn and Éomer eventually met on the battlefield and rejoiced, fighting alongside each other. But the battle raged on, and although they won, they lost many along the way, including Halbarad and many of the Great Company. In fact, Tolkien writes that Imrahil, Éomer, and Aragorn were about the only ones unscathed from battle. But after their victory, the 3 of them rode back to the city, and that is where the chapter ends. Now real quick, there are 2 final changes for today's episode. The first being that Legolas never kills a Mumakil by himself. And yes, despite how big of a deal that is, this still only counts as one change. The second change, and final one for this epic battle, is that the army of the dead never came to this fight. As you know if you watched my episode covering the Paths of the Dead army only helped Aragorn defeat the Corsairs in Pelargir, and then Aragorn held their oath fulfilled. So the only people who came to aid the fight in the Pelennor were Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Halbarad and the Grey Company, Elrohir, Elladan, and then a multitude of men who the Corsairs had enslaved along their trip but now had been freed. This small but mighty group was just enough to help Éomer and Imrahil win the day. This might be the most contentious point in the entirety of today's changes, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I think Peter Jackson and his team did a great job with this battle in almost every aspect. And in many ways, this scene shouldn't have been as good as it is given how much it is warped and changed. But that being said, this might be the main change that I disagree with, as there's almost no struggle at the end of this fight. It's like as soon as the dead show up, the battle is over. They're just a little too OP. But as I've already mentioned, Tolkien made it clear that the enemy wouldn't surrender, and the battle raged on for a while even after Aragorn arrived. So it's kind of anticlimactic to have this tough fight be resolved so quickly. But on that note, that wraps up all of our changes for this week. Now that you've heard it all, I want to hear from you. What do you think about this epic battle in the movie? Do you think that despite the dozens of changes, it's still held up on film? Let me know in the comments below. As always, be sure to like and subscribe, and check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.